Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I wanted to talk about being a dungeon master and pushing toward the best possible narrative you can create for your dungeon performers, people who play player characters at Dungeons and Dragons tables, and understanding how to do that through understanding film, and understanding film through Patrick Willem. Patrick Willem is a brilliant movie reviewer, and he has done the best breakdown I've ever seen of every single decade of American film. And by understanding every single decade of American film, he understands building a powerful narrative. And I want to talk about how to build a powerful narrative in context to the films of 2000 and of the 2000s and the 2010s, right? So Patrick Willem cut these out, and we need to understand as dungeon masters exactly what was being done in the 2000s and the 2010s. And what's really interesting is the same type of films was made in the 2000s as were made in 2010s. And the reason why is this packaging of films that I'm about to explain to you, it actually specifically these films, they actually very specifically were the same type of films, and this genre of film, this type of, actually not genre, this category of filmmaking covered 20 years, not just one decade, but 2 decades, right? Whereas every other, Patrick Williams started breaking down films starting in the 70s. The 70s were distinct, the 80s were distinct, the 90s were distinct, but 2000s and 2010 were both the same, and I want to tell you exactly what they were. They were both the same, and what they did was, it was flashy, prestigious presentation, flashy, prestigious packaging of famous intellectual properties. Okay, so let's look at the 2000s. Right, you saw this in the 2000s, The Dark Knight, flashy, prestigious packaging of DC Batman. Right, Harry Potter, flashy, prestigious packaging of this huge, famous intellectual property, right? And basically, you can really see, how powerful these are. In the 2010s, Thor Ragnarok, that's just like Marvel, flashy, prestigious packaging, right, of a famous intellectual property. And then that goes further. And then also in the 2000s, Spirited Away, and that was flashy, prestigious packaging of a famous intellectual property, which is Disney anime, right? Like, Spirited Away is iconically Disney anime. It is a Hayao Miyazaki film, but many Hayao Miyazaki films do not make it to America, right? Then in the 2010s, you had Blade Runner, right? 2049, which was a flashy, prestigious packaging of a famous intellectual property, right? Then you had Thor Ragnarok, and basically the 2010s were a continuation of this. And for 20 years, the type of films that Hollywood was making was iconically these. And in the 2010s, Avatar: Last Airbender, right? Flashing, prestigious packaging of a famous intellectual property, right? So you have examples all in the 2000s. You have examples in the 2010s, and the type of films that are being made are these flashy, prestigious packaging of famous intellectual properties. So what lesson do we learn as dungeon masters around this? Well, first of all, what we realize is that we realize why Dungeons and Dragons has embraced the multiverse, right? This type of storytelling narrative has been powerfully adopted in Dungeons and Dragons, right? The first one is Dungeons and Dragons tied itself to Magic the Gathering. So many intellectual properties are tied to Lord of the Rings, Warhammer 40K, Fallout, Post Malone, right? Like the Saturday 1980 morning cartoons, Stranger Things. The list goes on and on and on. Famous intellectual properties, right? Dungeons and Dragons tied itself to Rick and Morty, right? Like, there's just been a ton. And then Dungeons and Dragons tied itself to literally thousands of intellectual properties through the use of thousands of intellectual properties through Funko Pops, Yahtzee, Creo, right? And very famously through Fortnite. Dungeons and Dragons has tied itself to Fortnite as well. And so I could go on and on and on and on and explain to you all the intellectual properties that are very much expected to be found in your storytelling in Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is like, absolutely, this is a multiverse. Characters from everywhere should be showing up. The intellectual properties that you see in Funko Pops, the intellectual properties you see in Yahtzee, the intellectual properties you see through Magic the Gathering, the intellectual properties you see through Creo, right? And so Dungeons and Dragons, and this is absolutely, like, encouraged through Rick and Morty. They're like, oh, no. Dungeons and Dragons is not just a fantasy setting. Any storytelling can be told through Dungeons and Dragons, and we are very much seeing that, right? And so I think it is absolutely critical to understand this specific type, this 2-decade archetype of type of film, which is flashy, prestigious packaging of famous intellectual property. This was absolutely done in Hollywood, and this was very much mirrored in in the creation of Dungeons and Dragons narrative. And I think it's really critical to understand this as dungeon masters, so that we are including the correct type of stories as we progress forward. And we are not, letting our players down, and we are bringing in characters from these different worlds. And Dungeons and Dragons is not just stuck being a fantasy world. Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.